In this episode of Fuel Talk, we're going to talk about regulators. What are the two types of regulators and why are they blamed for everything? It's probably the biggest misconception that comes through, and it's not everybody that does it, but whenever you have a fuel delivery problem, the regulator always gets blamed. Why is that? And what does an actual regulator failure look like? Coming up. I had a boss one time that when we were developing fuel pressure regulators for the aftermarket, it was an aerospace company, and he had to scratch his head and go, why are they calling it a regulator when it's a relief valve? And it's a valid point. I really wish that automakers have decided to call EFI or bypass return style regulators as calling them for what they are, relief valves. It'd be a lot easier. That way we could have a fuel pressure regulator and a fuel pressure relief valve. They operate two different ways and are plumbed two different ways. And so that's not where we're at. They're both called regulators, and we're going to break down the two styles. The one style is called bypass return. Now this is the relief valve. If you think of it as a relief valve, its function makes a lot more sense. In that you can have your inlet pressure acting on a diaphragm, and there's a spring that counteracts the force created by that pressure. And once the pressure gets to that predetermined amount, it'll push up against that spring and start opening the valve to allow flow to go back to the fuel tank. So really it's a pressure opening valve. Once you get to that pressure, that valve opens. And on the contrast, it's more of an older style regulator that was mainly used for carbureted systems. And that when you get to that pressure, it instead of pressure opening, it's pressure closing. So a lot of times you can have your inlet pressure being at a higher pressure, and that once your pressure gets to the predetermined amount, that valve will close off. And that's how you regulate the outlet pressure on these regulators. Mostly now we are dealing with EFI regulators these days, if you have an EFI system. And so we're really talking about relief style regulators. It's also important to note that these regulators can also be used for carbureted systems once you have a light enough spring in them. And one of the important notes about a return style regulator is that how much pressure is being created in the return line itself. Now, most of the time, EFI regulators, they operate at maybe 45 psi or 60 psi. And so you get the pressure in order to get that flow rate going back to the tank. You have a lot of pressure that'll drive the fuel back. So if you're at 60 psi, you have 60 psi to act across that valve through your return line and dump into the tank. Now restrictions on the return line will, if you have enough, will eventually override the regulator. And in cases of things like a carbureted regulator, even a modest flow rate, you're going to need a decent sized return line. Let's say that you had the system set at 6 psi for your carburetor. That means you only have 6 psi to get the fuel flow that's unused, which would be all of the fuel pump. Let's say you're in idle condition or engine off. All the flow rate must come from the regulator back to the tank, and you only have the 6 psi acting on that to make that happen. Another case can come up with jet pumps. I'm going to get back into discussing saddle tanks. Sometimes the OEs use a jet pump or siphon pump, whatever they want to call them. The technical term is eductor. And that what it does is it uses fuel flow to allow the sucking on the saddle tank to draw fuel into its main half of the tank. And sometimes OEs use the return line for these. And whenever you do a fuel system modification, that can really overwhelm the return line, and that can give you a failed condition of having too much pressure, such that you back your adjustment. I don't have the adjustment spring shown in the diagram just for simplicity, but if you back off the adjustment all the way and you still don't have the pressure you need, chances are something's going on with the return line or the restrictions thereof. Another thing to note too is that whenever let's say that you have a fuel pump failure where it's not producing enough flow, or let's say that you have an air leak that's getting in there, messing with the efficiency of the pump and messing with its ability to pump. A lot of times with a bypass or relief style regulator, that you may have too low a fuel pressure. And that's easy to blame the regulator, but the regulator might be completely closed off, not allowing any flow to return, and whatever pressure that you're seeing is the maximum capability of the pump. So that's another type of failure that some people have called in and going, I have a fuel pressure regulator problem, And a lot of times it's characterized too by having inconsistency. Oh, it's working 1 minute, then not working, then it's low, and then it's back up again. And as we look into the structure of the regulator, there is a spring simply won't lose tension, then gain tension, and then lose it again. That's not a failure. That's not going to happen. So, but that's the only way that can be produced. But getting back to what type is better, it really comes down to two different things. One is, do you have multiple points of pressure? Meaning, let's say you had a carbureted system with nitrous oxide injection and a secondary fuel solenoids for that. You're probably going to want a more traditional or blocking style regulator. This allows you to have a higher pressure for the system and then be able to regulate down for your various things, like having a separate pressure control for your carburetor and a separate one for the fuel solenoid, such that you can tune the second one by adjusting the pressure in order to get the mixtures that you want for the vehicle. But overall, if you have one spot to do and you have enough return line, or you're at a higher enough pressure to handle it, that really the superior way is through a relief system. Some of the other regulators, you will have at moments of very low flow rates a little bit higher pressure than you normally would want. And I had a boss that called it triangulation, or call it what you will, that when you're trying to get your valve closed to zero flow rate, the poppet assembly is going to require extra force to make that happen, and that shows up as a result of a higher pressure condition. While a bypass style regulator, you're really going to be always flowing, and the only time that you have it just shut off is really at full capacity of the system. Let's say that the engine's taken 100% of the flow rate that's available of the pump. Your relief valve can turn off, and from that point your fuel pressure can drop off if you pull more and more fuel flow through the system or through your engine. So getting back to what type of failures really that these valves can encounter really come to two different failure modes. One of them is a loss of integrity on the diaphragm, such that the flow is getting into the top half of the regulator. Often on an EFI, this is where a port is being routed to an intake manifold. And if you ever wonder why that they do that, is that for every PSI in the top half of the regulator that is different, that results in a fuel pressure that is of that same change, such that if you put 10 psi of boost pressure into your top of the regulator, there's an extra 10 psi that occurs at your fuel pressure. And what that really, coming back, that's the function of it, but the reason is that whenever you do it this way, you will maintain a same pressure difference across the fuel injector. Since the fuel injector is being sprayed into the intake manifold, its inlet pressure is the fuel pressure that's at the relief pressure, and the outlet pressure is spraying into the intake manifold. So anytime you tie that line, and we talked about that in the last episode about a cavitation setup I had, but anytime you tie that line to the intake manifold or into the outlet of your injector, then the result is that you have a constant pressure across the injector. And that's the advantage of really just keeping a consistent pressure across it, and that way when you map it becomes consistent. I've noticed that a lot of drag racers for a naturally aspirated engine won't even hook up anything to this, and that's perfectly fine, mostly because their intake manifold simply is just opened up once they're running and racing, and you pretty much have zero vacuum anyway. It's kind of insignificant. So in that regards, and it doesn't matter that much. But getting back to this failure, once the diaphragm has failed, fuel will flow directly into the intake manifold. I found this clip the other day, and I thought, and shared it on the Facebook, and it really shows what that failure can look like.
So probably my favorite feature on my fuel pressure regulator, it's pretty sick, right? Well, whenever you need to really cool that air down, right? This is just a vacuum line, right? It's just cool, it's super dope. And then when you decide for it to not be a vacuum line anymore, it just gapes itself. Well, I'll show you exactly what happens. It's a really cool feature that I'm so excited. I'm so happy that I have this cool feature with this pressure regulator. Sick, so sick, super sick.
As you can see, that with that line hooked up, it shows up as fuel being dumped directly into the engine. That one becomes pretty obvious that when that failure occurs. So if you see leakage at that, what I call a pressure reference port, or some people just call it a vacuum port, if you have leakage there, then it's probably coming from a failed diaphragm. Now I'd say most of the time when you have a failed diaphragm, it's not a small failure. So I've never seen it where it's just leaking out according to customer results. But it is a very rare failure. And a lot of times regulator manufacturers have rebuild kits or just simply warranty the regulator for you. The types of diaphragm failures I've seen were mostly chemical, as a chemical reaction. And most of the time I'm not sure what got into the fuel, but upon getting a new diaphragm replaced, I never ran into the failure again. Another type of failure that can happen is if debris gets into the regulator. That debris can get lodged between the seat and poppet of the valve, and that would kind of force the regulator open. And that kind of effect would have that you can have a loss of capacity because the regulator's never really able to fully shut off or go towards and being shut off. And that has an effect of as if your fuel pump has lower capacity. Maybe in higher gears for a drag car, the capacity issues show up that you start losing fuel pressure. upon the engine making more power.
That makes it all good, right? All right, so we got a fuel system problem here with this. We already took care of an oil system problem that it had with this. Just some changeover stuff. So this thing lost lost fuel pressure in that wheelie run that you just saw. First hit. It is obvious that just cranking this thing is bypassing fuel, which it should not. So see if there's just something in it or if the diaphragm is torn. Let's see. Let's go put this in the vise. Oh, look at that. Piece of junk in there.
Don't know how that got in there.
See that?
Huh. I wonder how that got in there. Glad that ain't an injector.
And those are really two of the most common failures. But I hope that helps, and please like and subscribe, and we'll bring up new topics very shortly. Thanks.